for those of you who don't actually know who I am, which is pretty much everyone in the room, I am Usman Sheikh. That's me 2 weeks ago when I shaved my beard. But it didn't work out, so I had to grow it back on again. So I am currently heading up design and experimentation for Barclaycard Future Payments. So that is basically the lab's R&D part of Barclaycard. So we look at lots of future tech, emerging behavioral patterns, next-gen products and services and things like that, and all that jazz, basically. That's kind of what we look at. But apart from my sort of current role, for the last sort of better part of a decade, I've actually done my time in a lot of financial institutes. So in terms of the approach of design and innovation in those sort of larger corporates, I've got a relatively good idea in terms of the general state of affairs. But on the flip side, I've also been a founder and a partner in a series of startups. And in my current role, I have to sort of mentor quite a few FinTech startups. So basically, what this whole thing today is about is really just my point of view in terms of the differences, how FinTechs are actually approaching design and innovation, and how that sort of compares and contrasts with the wider corporates, basically. So when we talk about sort of disruption or disruptive innovation, I would say, obviously, I mean, I'm sure you would all agree that in the past, say, 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of buzz around it that everyone's basically doing one thing or the other, which is kind of, disrupting the market, and it's like, it's changing our lives and all of that. But in reality, if you think about it, it's nothing new, really. I mean, I wouldn't even go to the wider industry everywhere. I'm just looking at Barclays as a starting point. And if you look at the past sort of 50, 60 years, actually pause that, look at the last couple of thousand years, right? So a couple of thousand years, you would basically, the way people used to transact were basically the same. It was gold, silver pieces, or then became coins and all of that. That didn't change for thousands of years. And then if you go back a couple of hundred years, then that changed into sort of, IOU notes, basically, right? Those paper currency. That's what it is. They're IOU notes that will give you this much money if you give us this piece of paper. But if you look at the last 50 years, I mean, we changed that to, we introduced the first credit card, then the debit card, then peer-to-peer payments, then what else do I have in there? The ATM, the first ATM. I mean, can you imagine in the past actually just going and putting a piece of plastic in the wall and getting cash out of it? It's incredible. And now with sort of the modern online banking, mobile banking, and now wearables, basically, that's something that is just incredible. I mean, like this little piece of plastic on my watch is my new credit card, right? So things are evolving tremendously. But the big difference there is that it's not the fact that innovation or disruptive innovation didn't happen, it's the speed with which it's happening. That's the key thing to talk about, really. And the key thing here is that in the past 3 decades, there's been more sort of disruption in the way we do things compared to the last 300 years, or even more than that. I'm talking about 300 years because, I mean, again, in the context of my current employer, we've been around for 325 years, so I know exactly what's been done in that time. But again, that's not the best part either. The best part is that we're only just getting started, because the way the technology cycles, basically, the way things are improving, the way things are speeding up, that's actually moving forward in an exponential way as opposed to just a regular cycle, right? So the more powerful the computing power becomes, the more quickly we can compute more data, the more insights we can get out of it. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But you still have to ask the question that the fact that all this innovation is happening now, is it really just a case of technology getting better and better? I've got a slightly different opinion to that. So I think there's a generational impact there as well. So I mean, a lot of you guys are, I think, in the UX field. So these sort of predefined generational brackets, I'm sure you guys are all aware of this. But I just want to, I'm not going to go into detail in any of these things. I just want to highlight one or two key points which highlight the point that I'm trying to make here. So we go back to baby boomers, basically, people who came back from the Great War and they got busy and they sort of made lots of babies and things like that. But these parents, basically, they kept telling their kids that, you have no idea how good you have it, right? They haven't seen that sort of probably one of the worst times in the history of humankind, right? So they kept saying to their kids that you're lucky that you have food on your table and you have a roof on your head, and you should be thankful for the fact that you have something, right? So when these people, the Generation Xers, basically, they grew up as well, they kept telling their kids that, you have to save your money, you should be thankful for the fact that you have something. Their kids didn't see the sort of, the restricted nature of a lifestyle, basically, in their childhood. They saw things better. I mean, I'm totally take on board that I'm generalizing here, but it's just a point that I'm trying to make. So the Generation Xers, they saw life better than their previous generation. When that goes into Generation Y, they basically, things switched at that point. Because what they started thinking about was that enough of being thankful, right? That's great. We know that we have these things. We've got that. But if it's not serving my need, then I need something better. Why should I just go ahead and accept the fact that, okay, here's a package account, here's a product, this is what we're selling, you go ahead and buy it. Why should we do that? If my need is particularly that this is what I need, this small part of this big, massive product that you're selling me, if that's all I need, then I want that. And I want it better, because that's what my need is, right? So that generation became a lot less forgiving in terms of buying into products, buying into brands for that matter. You move that further even more to Generation Z, they basically grew up, they don't know a world without the internet, right? These are the current teens and preteens. So they not only, because of the fact that they've grown up with the idea of all that access to information, so even the smallest or any atrocities or any global events, that basically they have access to that in a matter of seconds and minutes, right? So it's a bit of an information overload. So they're very aware of this thing that, it's not just about us, it's about everyone. So one of the key characteristics of Generation Z is the fact that they want to make the world a better place, not just their own personal lives, they want to make the world a better place. So when you look at the last two generations, basically, the key aspect there is that there is an appetite to question everything, right? Whether that's a question to make the world a more connected place, or whether that's to challenge and to fight for young girls to have education all over the world. So they have this appetite to challenge everything. And now when you look at that context, aligned with the idea that technology is moving faster than ever before, that really that sets the scene for a lot of innovation, right? Because you have people who have access to technology, you have people who have the right attitude, they want to make things better, they don't want to just go ahead and accept the fact that this is how things are. If they think there's a better way of doing things, they want to do that. And if you look at the last sort of, say, 100 years or so, where did the innovation, most of the innovation come from, right? So the innovation used to happen in the Fords and the IBMs and the GEs of this world, the multi-million massive corporations which had hundreds of people working in R&D, and they were building up new products and all that. That whole scene is changing, because now the small guy can actually give the big guy a run for their money, because they have access to the same information, the same technologies, right? Because we know for a fact that technology itself is more or less commoditized now. It's the same technology stack that is being used in so many different places. So if you are even a smaller startup, you could basically get access to the same platforms, the same technology, same cloud-based infrastructures, and you can create products which are, solving problems. So when you keep that thing in mind, and you look at not just, so I know that the context of my conversation is very much around FinTech and financial services, but what's driving that is not just that sector. What's really happening is that there's this cross-pollination between multiple sectors, and the customer expectation of the experience is changing out of different verticals. So again, I mean, two examples which are just used to death basically, but I've still put them in there. That these are things which truly disrupted how those industries worked. But what did happen with that was that things like the idea of invisible payments within Uber, that you just order a car, it comes up, you sit down, you get to your destination, get out, and you move on. You never pay for anything in there. It's just completely invisible. That is an experience, right? So that's a form of interaction that customers have, in their millions, have really bought into. So those, I mean, that's just an example, but those sort of examples, they then sort of penetrate other sectors as well. And the customers basically, because as far as the customer is concerned, they don't really care whether it's a bank product, or they don't care about debits and credits and this, that, and the other. They care about their own experience. They care about what's happening in their lives and what would actually help them get to the point that they want to get to, right? That's the core driver behind everything. So those experiences, they're setting the benchmark for customer expectation. And that expectation is then something that we have to design for, because we then have to provide that absolutely seamless, absolutely frictionless experiences, irrespective of which sector you're working in. So that's driving a few things. Now, when talking about the cross-sector themes, I mean, I've just highlighted three in there. There are quite a few more. But these three things are basically something which is really driving a lot of the work that the fintechs are basically focusing on. So, I mean, the first one is really pretty straightforward. I think that's been around for a long time, but the focus on customer needs. So I started off by saying that usually, I mean, or historically, the case has been that big software companies, big hardware companies even, they would create a product which they think, this is what we think you need. And then basically consumers would just go ahead and buy those products because that's the option that they had. But now it's switching the other way around. It's basically all of these massive corporations, they're really focusing. I mean, it's a case of, somebody mentioned that term the other day, that it's a case of having more surgical strikes as opposed to massive bombardments, basically. That it's a case of this particular thing is what our consumers need. Let's solve that particular problem. So not with massive products, but with slimline products, thin apps, thin experiences which tackle one problem at a time. And that's obviously relates to the next trend in there as well, the idea of decoupled services. That's pretty much what I've just said. That the idea of having something like Microsoft Office, for instance, which you buy into, but you have like, a million things that you would never need, and all you need is just a basic word processor. So why pay for all of those things? That's why you have things like Microsoft, what's it called, the 360, I think, that you can just basically pay for the stuff that you need and you just use that. So everyone across the various sectors, they're trying to decouple their services so that people can just pay for what they want. The whole SaaS model, all of those things which you've heard a million times before, it's all based around the fact that you give us a subscription, you don't have to pay us for a license for the rest of your life, you pay us for how long you need that utility for, and you get access to the utility that you're looking for. Finally, humanized interfaces. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but that's another thing, that it's right now, from an experience design perspective, it's all about storytelling, it's all about conversations. It's no longer about, here's a set of 15 rules and you follow that and you fill in a form and this and that. It's all about having a more human interaction with whatever it is that you're using, whether it's an app, whether it's a voice-based interface, or whatever it is. Now, that's all well and good. Now, obviously, one key factor here is that even though the focus of the conversation is around fintechs and startups, but with this move in the industry, it's not really a case where all of these banks and all these sort of big, massive financial organizations are just sitting on their hands and basically not doing anything. Every single major financial organization that I'm aware of is sort of running like anything, trying to sort of in some cases catch up, in some cases lead the way in terms of how innovation should be led and what's the right way of doing that in a large corporation which has tremendous amounts of bureaucracy and an incredibly hierarchical culture, this, that, and the other. But we still have to evolve, right? Otherwise we become obsolete. So again, I mean, if you look at the last, I'd say maybe five to 10 years, there's been a lot of conversation around, I mean, when the whole sort of FinTech as a sector sort of came into being in a way, there was a lot of fear around it, basically. That, okay, I mean, all of these sort of young startups are going to come in and they're going to, eat our lunch, breakfast, dinner, this, that, and the other, in terms of, the banks would be obsolete and all of that. We all know that didn't happen, right? So why didn't it happen? Because very, very quickly, people on both sides came to a realization that actually, when you talk about banks versus startups, they both have something to offer which the other doesn't, right? When you think of a large financial organization like a bank, you have millions of customers, you have deeper pockets, obviously. And I mean, if you were to basically create a new product or a service, we can take 1% of our customer base, test it with them, and get the insights that a lot of the startups would really struggle with. And I'm, again, generalizing, but that's kind of one of the things. On the other hand, when you think of startups, I mean, they have the agility to really sort of, go ahead and try out new things, just work in a super agile way, and really get to the point of a functional prototype in a fraction of the time that a major bank would do. And at least in a lot of cases, especially in the earlier stage startups, there's a lot of reduced red tape, so they don't have to go through a lot of the compliance and regulations and all of that just to try out things the way the banks have to, because they're under a lot more scrutiny, right? So the big thing that happened over the last couple of years was a big change in attitude. So what both sides realized, that this isn't a challenger relationship, it's basically an enabler relationship. So banks have the customers, they have the bigger problems, whereas startups have the agility and the right mindset to actually solve those problems. So a lot of the major financial organizations, they've basically started working together in partnerships, basically across the board, for the startups to actually solve the problems that the banks already have. So it's a good sort of synergy there now. Now, most of the larger organizations that I've sort of been aware of, they're taking a slightly different approach. They're taking a VC approach where they're kind of buying equity into those startups, and they've got skin in the game. So they're basically trying to just put money towards it and let them basically do whatever they want to do. Barclays and Barclaycard, they've taken a very different approach to this. They've basically not just sort of embraced the fact that this change is happening. They've basically decided that why don't we support this change to happen? This is going to happen one way or the other. So how about we actually create a global ecosystem which genuinely supports and it nourishes these startups. So we created Rise. So Rise is our global platform for FinTech startups. And we're working with people like Techstars, for instance. So they're like hundreds of mentors. So every time, so we have an accelerator program that happens. There are like 2 cohorts in each country every year. And we bring in sort of, usually there are about 600 to 800 startups that apply, about 10 or 11 come through into the actual cohort. But when they do come in, they have access to data, they have access to infrastructure, they have access to over 100 mentors, and they're really sort of taken care of and basically helped to, well, accelerate, right? That's the reason for it. Now, there was a little video that I wanted to play here, but I have a feeling that we can't play that video. Great, excellent. So I'm going to just skip from there, and we can, so that we have a little bit more time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. So I'm going to move on to the next part, basically, which is some of the emerging trends that are occurring across, I'd say across the industry, within finance, for instance. So some of the things that I'm going to highlight here are, again, no surprises here. AI and machine learning, that is probably the hottest thing that's happening across financial services right now. I mean, my team alone is kind of working on so many different projects and pilots for this. Everything from sort of monitoring customer behavior to highlighting sort of fraud patterns and things like that. Again, something like this would not have happened 5-10 years ago because we simply did not have the computing power, the access to the data, and the attitude towards that this can potentially change our lives, the way we actually run our business. So artificial intelligence is something that is immense at the moment. And as I said, I mean, so from a startup perspective, this is something that's also a massive hotbed because what they're doing is exactly as I said before, they're focusing on the customer experience, right? So I've been talking about the idea of basically predictive banking for a couple of years now. And the whole idea behind that is that the way online banking works today, or the way banking works today basically, is that everything is reactive. So it's basically you go into overdraft and then you get a notification saying that you've gone into overdraft, right? And then you get charged for it and all of that. But why can't we be in a situation where we can actually monitor the way, I mean, we all know that we live our lives in patterns, right? We all know this thing. We get paid mostly around the same time in the month. Our direct debits go out at the same time. We usually shop at the same supermarkets. We do, we most of the time buy our petrol from the same petrol pumps. We do all of those things basically. There's a pattern to our lives. And if you look at a particular customer, you look at how they've been living their lives for the last 6 to 8 months even, or you can go further than that if you want, patterns start to emerge. And in a lot of cases in our research, what we found out was that a lot of people who were actually regularly going into overdraft, they were actually going into overdraft, that's just an example obviously, but they were going into overdraft around the same time of the month because of the same payment that was going out of their account, but they weren't basically doing anything about it. So why can't we actually be more proactive in that way, that we actually tell our customers that, look, this is a pattern. You have some money sitting in your savings. If you move that around, you can actually save some money by not paying for the fees, right? So there's an aspect there of where you can actually do that. The second thing is conversational interfaces. Again, whether we're talking about voice or we're talking about chatbots, again, this is very much related to the first point as well, that there's using artificial intelligence, but taking a conversational approach to it is another part that is basically changing considerably. Using chatbots, again, is something like the Facebook Messenger platform. Again, that's a tried and tested model, right? We all know about WeChat and everything that they've done in China. That's what Facebook is basically catching up on. But using that as an interface, using Alexa as an interface, so Amazon Echo as an interface to provide a service to the customer, that's another sort of big, hot area of where a lot of the both startups and actually banks are working towards. Connected devices, again, I'm sure you can see the underlying trend here. The underlying trend here is data and how we manipulate data and how we sort of work with data. And I mean, there was a case where we were basically, or a few years back, we were very consciously generating data, like we would publish something on Facebook, or we would tweet, or we would do something like that. But with the idea of connected devices, you're basically leaving a trail of data just by doing nothing, just by walking around just living your life, you're leaving a trail of data. And that data is incredibly valuable. That's where Google and Facebook and Amazon and all these people, they have access to a lot of your data, a lot of your behavioral data, which they can actually then use to create something, to create not just marketing, but to create a service that is genuinely aligned to how you live your life as an individual, not as a demographic, but as an individual. And I think that's the power of these things. Again, this is one that I'm incredibly passionate about. I've mentioned pays and variables and all of that in here because that's something which is which a lot of you would be familiar with. But again, the core concept there is the idea of invisible payments. So I referred to Uber as an example, but there's no reason why that same model, that same payment model, can't be applied in a lot of different places. Basically legalized shoplifting, in essence. You go into a shop, you pick up whatever you want, you walk out of the store, and you get charged for it, right? So that is basically, again, that's stuff which is, by the way, everything that I'm talking about here, this is not science fiction by any means. These are things which are happening today. These are experiments, these are pilots, these are startups working on specifically those areas. And you can imagine how the implications of things like that, and I'm talking about the next couple of years of how this would actually have an impact. And finally, just 3 things to take away from today. One is, when I talk about technology and everything around it, infrastructures and things like that being commoditized, that means that in the now and in the near future and in the future, the customer experience is going to be the true differentiator between products and services. So that's great news for all of us, obviously, because there's more value in true UX and CX design, right? So when every single bank, every single startup, every single organization is basically working with the same technology, then it's the experience that would differentiate and that would basically draw in the customers. The second thing is that when we're designing future experiences, focus on the behavior, not just the need. Now, again, it seems like a no shit Sherlock kind of comment, but it's one of those things where, the way we tend to work is that we've gone from designing for functionality to designing for needs. So in a lot of places, that transition has happened, although a lot of people are still struggling with that. People are still saying that, we need to have search up there. Why do you need the search up there? No, but we need to have the search up there, right? So it's based on functionality. So when you switch that around to needs, that's a good step forward. But when we're talking about future stuff, it's kind of like, again, it's a very common example, but before the iPhone, nobody knew that they needed a smartphone, right? Now they need a smartphone. So the need existed based on the behavior that was identified by Steve Jobs. Anyway, so the point is that look at how people's lives are changing, look at how their behaviors are changing, look at how the fact that, for instance, voice is becoming more and more common, that is going to have an impact on a lot of different interfaces. Artificial intelligence is going to get smarter, which means that things like Siri and Alexa and all of that is actually going to get smarter as well. So it's going to be more integrated in a lot of different devices. The connected experiences are actually going to be a lot more intelligent. In which case, how would that change the behavior? And if you start sort of projecting that behavior and you start aligning a lot of the experiences with that behavior, then we're in a good position to actually have a relatively educated guess to how things would move forward. And finally, future is all about collaboration, not confrontation, right? This is a big point. Again, I'm saying nothing new here. I'm sure most of you would be practicing this thing anyway, but when I talk about collaboration, I'm talking about collaboration across the board in terms of different sectors. I'm talking about different types of technologies, different types of experiences. There's a lot of, there's no longer a case that, okay, let's bring everything in-house and we'll build everything by ourselves. We all use APIs and we use SDKs and all of those sort of things to basically make sure that, okay, if there's this particular company that has thin sliced an experience, and they've actually created a particular sort of service that serves my need perfectly, then why do I need to create that again? Let's bring that in and let's create an experience which would actually support, take this, and create an actual experience rather than a product that actually covers a lot of those things. And I think I'm going to wrap up there. So that's it. Any questions? Thank you.
Okay, just before lunch, because we're going to have a bit of lunch, time for a question or two?
Yeah.
It's Health Week.
Thank you. So there's been a trend, at least on Android, for all the banking companies to have an emphasis on security, and as part of that emphasis on security, they're trying to fight against the system to do a lot of things. For example, with user input, with keyboards, each of the different banking applications has a custom keyboard instead of using the system one. Or, for example, with adaptive technologies like TalkBack, it's fighting against it and trying to do things automatically, like reading parts of the screen out loud that the user didn't necessarily want them to read out loud. Is that going to change with this focus on the customer and the focus on the experience? And how is that going to change with the emphasis on security still being there?
I think security is a great point, which I actually just realized I didn't cover a lot. But security is obviously, considering, especially my background in financial services, that's something that is probably one of the key things that is being worked on. I think so there were a couple of different aspects to your question, the way I understood it at least. One is very much to do with behavior, I feel, because it's to do with what we find acceptable and what we don't find acceptable, right? So I think that, in my personal opinion, I think that would change. It's just like everything else. I mean, again, go back a couple of years when the first sort of Galaxy Note came out. I mean, the amount of jokes that circulated with anyone holding a massive phone today. Now if you actually see a 4-inch phone, that feels a little awkward that, you know, how is this actually, why you have such a tiny phone? So there are certain things which just become the norm, right? So, and again, at the end of the day, there's a balance between value and sort of perceived security in a way. So in the same way that if you were to just write down how much data or how much Google is monitoring all of your movement, your search, your email, your this, that, and the other, if you just read that, you would say, no way in hell I want to allow that to happen, right? But in reality is that we all live with that because we get we get a really streamlined, personalized experience out of it, right? Same goes for, again, the Uber example of you actually letting them have your credit card details, or Amazon letting them have your credit card details. All of those things would have been a bit of an issue, but it became a norm, right? So in terms of security as well, I think there's a case of perceived security and of actual sort of infrastructural security in the background. So I think there's a part of that. To answer your question around the personalized keyboards, for instance, so there, again, that's just one of the possible solutions, basically, that people are working on. There's lots of other things like behavioral biometrics, for instance, right? That's another big area that is being looked into. So you don't need to have a different keyboard or this, that, and the other. You can actually monitor how you're holding your phone, how much weight you're putting in, which finger you're using to actually swipe. You can, how do you tap with 2 thumbs or 1 thumb? You can actually monitor all of those things, so you can actually have a sense of security across the entire experience as opposed to just as a gateway model, right? So I think that the two things, for instance, that you've mentioned, they are two in a plethora of other things that a lot of these different companies are actually using to say that, okay, their stuff is actually more secure than the next one, right? And again, as I said, there's a sense of, and I keep repeating that, but there's a sense of perceived security as opposed to actual security. And I think that there's going to be a lot more work done in there, and the general behavior is going to change as well. Yep.
Great. We're going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Right,